Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Boston Blockchain Association's Big Bites virtual panel. Today, we're going to talk about the truth about mining, community, energy, and AI with Matt Williams from Luxor, David Schatz from Riot, and Andrew Birchwell from the Ohio Blockchain Council. Before we get started, just wanted to talk a few things about the BBA. So for the BBA, our vision is to promote the adoption and growth of blockchain technology by connecting innovators, thought leaders, institutions, and market leaders together through education, networking, and collaboration. Since 2019, the mission of the BBA is to foster a thriving community around blockchain and related emerging technologies by supporting educational programming, inspiring innovation, and empowering the ecosystem participants with valuable resources and insights. And then thank you to our sponsors, our platinum member, the Mass Tech Collaborative, our gold members, Aon. So I am a part of NFP, an Aon company, FCAT, Fidelity Digital Assets, Fidelity Investments, Ripple, and silver, Algorand, Amber Data, KPMG, Ropes and Gray, Stand with Crypto, our business partners, Block Health, the Crypto Recruiters, Israel David, Keybridge Advisors, Media Shower, and Solana. Our startup partners include Develop Medicines, FYAO, Influx, Cadena, and True Tickets. And our community sponsors, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, FinTech Women, Niche, Suffolk University, and Tab Group. On that note, please get involved with the BBA. We encourage you, of course, to join as a corporate member, an individual member, become a volunteer. You can get all the information you need at bostonblockchain.org or connect with us directly. Just a few housekeeping items. Bear in mind that this is being recorded. We will have Q&A available throughout the panel. We will have a devoted Q&A session at the last 15 minutes, but please feel free to ask questions during our discussion. There will be a follow-up survey, and we would love your feedback. Bear in mind that what we're looking for is your feedback on what you would like to see for future virtual sessions as well as in person. Frankly, I would love to have a mining session in person in Boston. And lastly, please connect with the panelists. They're going to share some invaluable information today. I hope paint a beautiful picture of what the digital asset mining industry looks like, but do connect with them. And before we get started into the presentation, I'd just like to share how I came to be in digital assets. And that has to do with who's going to be sharing their insights today. So back when I left insurance, I was working for an e-com company, and a man by the name of Chad Harris was a customer of mine. Fast forward a few years later, I join NFP and I hear about some crazy thing he's doing in Rockdale, Texas. And I reach out and ask him, oh my God, Bitcoin mining, tell me about this. And before I know it, I am going to Rockdale, Texas, about every month and a half, 2 months, to go to a construction trailer where Chad, Dave Harris, Lyle Theriot, and Ashton Harris and their dogs were feverishly building a 700 megawatt mining operation. Lots of power across from one of Texas's largest switching stations. And so it was incredible to see what that looked like. And when we're talking about technology, we often don't think about the tactile nature of that. And it was inspiring to see what that meant for the community in Rockdale. and the things that Dave often got volunteered for when he was too busy to join calls. And then fast forward to meeting Andrew and getting to go to Ohio and see what he's doing in Ohio, the different sites. This is the Rust Belt, and these are areas much like Rockdale after Alcoa's exit that had been neglected. And so there was a real opportunity there. And I loved seeing that. And it certainly made me passionate about the mining space and the digital asset space more broadly. And then Matt Williams at Luxor, very well connected in the community. I can't believe that we have not been best friends already and spent lots of time together like I have with Andrew and Dave. But I thought this gave greater context to this space and how real it is. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion and having each of them introduce themselves and talk about their perspectives on the mining industry and how they got into it. So with that, gentlemen, Andrew, if you would like to start.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. And hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Birchwell. I'm currently the Executive Director of the Ohio Blockchain Council. For a little over a decade, I've spent my career focusing on energy technology, R&D, and critical infrastructure development, formerly at a company called Battelle here in Columbus. And it was through that lens of public-private partnership and kind of top-down view of how energy infrastructure gets developed. And because of a personal passion for Bitcoin that goes all the way back to 2011, I discovered this thing called Bitcoin mining in 2020 and got supremely fascinated by its implications. 2021 decided, hey, this is something that seems really interesting to work on. Developed an independent consulting and development firm with a business partner, Vibe Energy, that allowed me entrance to the market to learn as much as we can and to develop projects as we thought, we might be useful towards. And in 2022, because I sit in Columbus, Ohio, and because of the China ban and exodus, and because of the trend that we were seeing in the growth of Bitcoin mining in the United States, and because of states like Texas, Massachusetts, Wyoming, Florida, and others that were organizing really well from a state perspective, we really felt like Ohio was also a place where this industry could thrive and that it lacked the organization necessary to really tell that story. So we started the Ohio Blockchain Council in 2022 with partners largely focused on Bitcoin mining, but for the digital assets industry in general, to really speak to the business community and the political stakeholders and advocate for this technology and really sell the story of why it should come to Ohio in spades. I'm thankful that that story has come true to a certain degree. We think it's continuing to grow and just very grateful to be amongst a community of really stout creative thinkers that are developing what I think is a very frontier technology. So thanks again for having me.
Great. Dave?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. And happy to be here. My name is David Schatz. I'm the Senior Vice President of Operations at Riot Platforms. Initially, I got into Bitcoin back in about 2017, kind of found it by accident, deep dive, into it, got very interested, um, really researched the Bitcoin mining side of it, and kind of started doing it with some friends as a hobby. And myself in nature, I'm very mechanical, enjoy fixing things, enjoy, tinkering around. So we kind of built out a very small mine, which very quickly kind of compounded and became bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it started kind of attending some Bitcoin conferences and trying to understand and meet other folks in the industry to kind of expand our knowledge. And had the opportunity to meet some folks that were interested in getting in Bitcoin mining, but didn't understand necessarily how to build it or how to facilitate. And by this point, we'd had some experience. So got very lucky and decided to go down the rabbit hole of getting some customers and, formed a business there and started to take on a few customers. And then that blew up very quickly, took on more and more customers, and then expanded to some different warehouses. And then fast forward to 2021, Riot Platforms actually purchased the company I worked for, where we ended up in Rockdale. We had a few buildings running at that point, and then from that point, we expanded into immersion and built out our facility in Rockdale, and then took on an additional facility in Corsicana and built out immersion there as well. So, been a pretty exciting, quick, fast iteration of things.
Thank you. And Matt, please.
Yeah, thank you for having me, by the way. I have a very different origin story than these two. I've been in Bitcoin since 2016. So I started off my career as a commodities trader, started off in oil and gas, and then kind of moved to agriculture. And throughout my career, I had a couple different turns and ended up at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is the largest commodity exchange in the world. Um, I worked for a corporate strategy team that was focused on fintech specifically. And in 2016, there was a lot of hype around digital assets. And so the team that I worked on was kind of like forced to go explore Bitcoin. I like to joke that I probably had the longest dissolving orange pill ever because when I first was put in Bitcoin, I was very skeptical. I was one of those people that doubted the value of it due to lack of intrinsic value and all the other arguments you start here. And so basically, I was, handed this remit of, find out what this is all about. I went and got a wallet, I bought some Bitcoin, I bought some ETH, I bought some other stuff. And then it just kind of morphed into a digital asset team at CME, which I was a part of. 2017, we launched Bitcoin futures. And then my job became explaining Bitcoin to all these traditional finance people. So large banks and hedge funds and traditional trading groups. And, during the course of multiple years, I started understanding the value of it and really became, quite a believer in it. Between then and now, I did a short pit stop in the regulatory world, trying to help some regulatory groups understand the space and figure out how to regulate it. I realized that wasn't for me. Joined Luxor 3 years ago, and my remit to date has been to build tools for Bitcoin miners to be able to not hedge out, manage their risk exposures, be it the energy or Bitcoin price or the revenue that they get from their mining machines.
Wonderful. Thank you. Um, so when we're looking at communities, so I've broken it into 3 categories, and these can certainly evolve, but I think speaking to the impact of mining on community, because we often see stories, I have to say, have lessened, but they're still out there, of negative impacts to community. And so why I titled this panel "The Truth About Mining" is because I thought it was important to paint a full picture. It doesn't mean that some of those stories are not accurate, but rather what's the full story of the impact on communities that have mining operations. So I'll leave it to you to take that. I don't know, Dave, if you want to start.
Sure, yeah, great question. And as you mentioned, Karen, it can be the fact. I'll speak to kind of riots impact and what we've done. We've done it now twice in 2 small communities, starting with Rockdale. And from our perspective, it's a very positive impact, and it's mutual, right? So we've come into a small town, and we build out very large facilities. So Rockdale, for instance, is 100 acres. It's a pretty large facility, and we have 7 buildings at that facility, as well as a substation on our site. So we have roughly 250 employees, and then not including our outside contractors. So within that, we have specialized electricians, we have crane operators, we have CDL drivers, minor maintenance technicians, IT, SOX compliance, HR. I mean, you name it, we have it. And the unique thing about coming into a small town is often there aren't high-paying jobs in those towns, right? And so for Rockdale, for instance, you have a lot of professionals that had maybe previously worked at Alcoa before it closed, which is the largest employer in their town, and they're traveling to Hutto or Taylor or Austin to work, right? And so having a company come in that needs those skill sets, and they can live in their small town and operate, it's a huge win for us, right? And we basically come in and we become a part of the community. So it's just a positive impact all the way around. And then within that, we're able to offer training programs and have progression. So you can find somebody that's interested in HR, right, and hire on, and they start off in the low level, and then they're able to move their way up and become a director or a VP. For example, we have our vice president of operations that's over the Rockdale and Corsicana facility. He started off in our inventory department, and he kind of worked throughout every job within our company in the operations side, and moved all the way up to being in charge of almost 300 people now at this point. So for us, we see it a very positive impact.
Perfect. Andrew?
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in on that. I think it's such a great point, and Riot is such a great example of what happens in transforming a community from what it used to be, what it became, and then what it can be again. And I think when most people say that Bitcoin mining might be bad for a community, I think they're really missing the fact that the downside risk of industry has already impacted these communities. So many industries have picked up and left, or they've been closed for certain economic reasons, or the globalization of the last 50 years or so. And there are so many of these communities that have no way to recover, essentially, because of the concentration of where industries trend today. I think it's what is beautiful about Bitcoin mining is that it can place itself in these places in ways that many other industries cannot. And then you get this ability to not only transform the workforce of that community by offering them opportunity, but frankly, sometimes it's even as simple as just cleaning up a mess that was left behind. I think there's a great example of that in Ohio with, an old paper mill. There's a lot of like old aluminum smelting plants and paper mills in the story of Bitcoin mining, you'll notice. And what was left behind was not only the devastation of 500 jobs leaving the community, but an eyesore and, frankly, a den and haven for nefarious activity, right? It just became an eyesore to the community that nobody else wanted to come in and clean up. But because it was located adjacent to a substation and had 50 megawatts of available power, all of a sudden there's this incentive to do something really interesting. And I think that story needs to be told more. It's very difficult, when you're growing an industry to say there are many of these examples, but I do think we are at that point today where we can look all across the country, not just in Ohio, and say there are many communities that have been revitalized by this activity. And now other industries can look to serve that community as well, because there's a resurgence of activity that leads to development of skills, that leads to all these other things. And at the very least, what we're doing in the process of building these facilities is rehabilitating the infrastructure that is necessary for these facilities. So even if Bitcoin mining isn't the 30-year solution, what you're leaving behind is an improved capacity to do other things. And I think that this is something that, again, it takes time to tell, but I think it's something that I'm really interested in is how do we reinvest in the infrastructure for many things through this quick start, fast action development of Bitcoin mining, which, largely speaking, relative to other types of data centers, you can build very quickly. I think that's an economic development story that goes far above and beyond just Bitcoin mining. And I think it's something that, we need to do a better job of telling that story. But I think at the end of the day, we tend to forget sometimes this is a fairly nascent and new industry. And so I think time will tell. And I think we're just beginning to see that progress and growth.
Yeah, I think the point too, when you're talking about building out that local infrastructure, it's something that I've had a lot of conversations about where folks will again talk about the negative misconceptions around mining, and it's really difficult for Karen Knox to call someone and complain about um, the lack of fiber. I don't have high-speed internet. And so when you're someone calling, picturing it from, let's say, an apartment behind the piano bar in Rockdale, Texas, and they're saying, hey, I'd love some high-speed internet, hey, I'd really like this, this, and this. It's really hard for them to be heard or for action to be taken. But when you have entities like a Riot coming into Rockdale and revitalizing and building infrastructure that does support the entire community, even if they're not interacting directly with Riot. So all the things like Dave talked about, the job training, the opportunities for that workforce that's there. And so for context, the cities, the towns that Dave was talking about, there's like 45-minute, hour plus drive for folks. It's not like, I'm sitting just outside of Boston and it may take that long, but everything's close, right? I'm in the suburbs. This is a town that is, again, really easy to forget and not have the necessary infrastructure to thrive. And so I think we forget those ancillary byproducts of having industry come in to what you were saying, Andrew, about developing the revitalization, the energy, the mayor in Coshocton being excited about the development happening in that town because of Standard Power and other people coming into the area. And Matt,
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably less versed on it. I mean, David gets to see it firsthand and Andrew knows the space well, but I mean, just what we hear anecdotally, we spend a lot of time with our customers that are in West Texas or all over Texas, and they're just, you hear about the 22,000 jobs that have been created, across Texas, just from Bitcoin mining. I think some of the things, the ancillary benefits you get, there's, you know, tax advantages from taxable purchases that come from these, large publicly traded Bitcoin mining companies that goes towards, civic events, it goes towards schools, it goes towards, community in general. When I first started, actually the first day I started at Luxor, we went on a site tour, and you kind of see like the town around the sites. And I think this is fairly ubiquitous across sites is, they could use some help, and a lot of these sites, areas or places that could use development. And that could be, improvements to grid infrastructure. I think a lot of the miners that are there, they need these improvements for grid infrastructure, and then they need some of the innovation that comes with, energy consumption. But those are benefits that are passed on to the community just from the investments that these mining companies are making. And so, yeah, I'm a big believer in it. I think, when I first started, the narrative was pretty negative around mining and energy consumption and that kind of stuff. But you do start to you hear these stories a lot more these days, and I think that's a really good thing. It does consume a lot of energy, but so do a lot of other things. You have to look for the ancillary benefits that come from it.
and this is why I think it's so easy to have these categories of community, energy infrastructure, and AI together because, oh, mining's terrible. It uses so much energy. But everyone is using AI. Are you using Copilot now? How are you using AI in your business? We just had a sales kickoff at NFP where Eric Anderson from Aon and Doug Hammond, our CEO, had a fireside chat to kick us off, and they spoke about AI heavily and how is that impacting the industry. And so that's great when we're sitting on our computers and talking about the function of AI, but where's the computing power come from? And so I think there's that real disconnect. I was at an event and I was talking to an architect, and they're like, "Oh, I don't use a lot of power. Oh, mining, yeah, way too much power," and just like such a visceral reaction to the concept of mining and the power it takes. And yet the computing that it takes for an architect and engineer to do their job is considerable. And then let's add in AI. So I think when we're talking about, again, mining and energy infrastructure, there's so much to unpack there, but that's such an obvious one. What does mining do to the grid? And so how are we helping these communities? How are we strengthening the grid by including mining, which then can benefit other operations like AI or other industry?
I can start. It's really interesting when you look at it from a systems level perspective about what it takes to provide energy now and into the future. And we're at a moment, we see this in Ohio, Texas, famously also is sort of raising the red flag that, hey, the growth that is coming is going to be very difficult for us to meet because we're going to have to create new energy generation to meet the demand. All right. So in Ohio, for instance, we were in a moment 4 years ago. We have two nuclear facilities in Ohio, over 2 gigawatts of power. But at the time, those facilities were maybe serving 40% of their capacity to the market. And the company that owned them at the time, it's since been sold to a different entity, was considering whether or not it was worth keeping those plants online because it was a financial decision ultimately. And so what would that look like today if all of a sudden, in the face of unprecedented demand, we were also short over 2 gigawatts of firm baseload power? That would be a catastrophe. We would be in a really hard position. And so, one of the things it does, of which it does many things well, I think, is a system within systems, is that it provides the incentive for these generation facilities to be maximally utilized and thus maximally profitable ultimately when you consider it on net. And not only that, it's incentivizing the development of new and better energy generation of all different types, right? It doesn't have to be just coal, natural gas, nuclear. I know that would love for David maybe to speak a little bit on this, but the intersection of novel energy technologies is a function of the ability to put Bitcoin mining in places you couldn't have put it before. Waste to energy type projects, for instance, couldn't find a market because you ultimately have to sell the power to market somehow. And typically there aren't large distribution lines from a waste facility to somewhere that it needs to be served, but Bitcoin mining can be put right on site. And so, one of the things that we're seeing, I think, and we'll continue to see, is this flexible intersection of multiple different types of industries where Bitcoin mining can essentially be that load balancer. And I think that just serves the financial interests of both the Bitcoin mining side of this, but also the energy infrastructure generation, transmission, distribution, et cetera, because, we waste a lot of energy within our system as it stands. Most people, I don't think, really realize this or could really comprehend how much is just lost in transmission, lost in inability to utilize at any given time. And that's only going to get more complicated as we add intermittent renewables to the system and as load demand increases and we have, conditions that are not ideal. And so really the story we're trying to tell, especially to the state stakeholders who are thinking about this problem very seriously, is Bitcoin mining is a tool. Forget about what it's doing for Bitcoin and just think about it as the most flexible large industrial load that's ever existed. And we are able to do things with that we've never been able to do before within the energy grid system. And so I think that's, again, a story worth telling, but also something that we've just begun to really realize how maximally effective that can be.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what Andrew was saying is, Bitcoin mining is such a unique industry. We participate, Riot specifically, and a lot of other companies participate in different uh, power programs, right? So we can curtail our load or turn off at any point in time, and there's no negative effects to our business model, right? And in the fact, it's good for us to turn off because then we can do preventative maintenance and things like that. So in the ERCOT system, we participate in several different programs where when the grid needs it, there's strain on the grid, or we have some overcast days and it's not sunny or wind's not high and there's some strains, we can actually shed our load at an instant's notice and provide that back to the grid to prevent rolling brownouts or rolling blackouts. And as Andrew mentioned, Bitcoin mining can go in the middle of nowhere. So over the last several years, it's become popular to utilize flare gas, right? There's Bitcoin miners going up in the oil field, where typically this flare gas would just be vented to the atmosphere and wasted. They're able to capture that and run a generation system that or a genset that now runs a small amount of Bitcoin mining. So it's a very unique opportunity to kind of have a small footprint in very unique and remote spaces.
Yeah, sorry, just to jump in there, I could not agree more on what you both said. I think what makes Bitcoin mining super unique is just the flexibility, the ability, as David said, to power up, power down based off of consumption needs, that adds stability to the grid. What's actually also interesting from the mining perspective is, in many cases, due to the programs that you reference, you're financially incentivized to power down too, right? So not only do you get the benefit of having a maintenance window, but you're getting financially rewarded for it, and you're contributing to the grid stability as well. And I really think the power consumption innovation that's developed, particularly around renewables that aren't necessarily integrally connected to the grid, is super interesting to me. I think where Bitcoin mining is underrated is how much it contributes to innovation in power consumption. I think, when I joined in 2022, this narrative wasn't out there enough. And the reason I think it's interesting is because it's hard to incentivize innovation and power consumption through policy. Maybe Andrew feels differently, but I think it has to be incentivized monetarily. And Bitcoin miners are naturally incentivized to find the cheapest source of power. And in many cases, that can be, wind or solar or hydro or even like geothermal, or there's a bunch of really cool ideas that exist. And that innovation is driven, through miners trying to find the cheapest amount of hash costs. Like how do you operate the cheapestly so you can have the higher margins when you're mining? And that is a benefit that is passed on to everyone else because now this innovation and this investment that goes into that innovation is available to anyone. It's widely acceptable and used, and that's because of Bitcoin mining. And I just think that's a point that often gets missed in the narrative.
How do you think that this innovation in energy fuels what's happening with AI? What would AI data centers look like had Bitcoin not occurred?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I probably have a different answer that's less direct to your question, but like I think the the investment that's gone into this innovation has enabled, miners to build out data centers that have low cost energy. And now basically what's happened is, they've started to realize that there's this secondary benefit of maybe like we go into AI, we take that power source or that data center and we lease it out or we rack it and sell the GPUs or the HPC out. It's a much higher margin. Well, currently anyway, it's a much higher margin revenue for them. And so I think it's just expanded capacity for that market. I think it's just, the enablement of finding cheap sources of power and building out the infrastructure is probably the biggest contributor to the growth, at least that the miners are contributing to the AI build out. I don't know if David feels or Andrew feels differently.
No, I think you're right, Matt. What's interesting is that from my perspective, I don't think that we would have seen, let's say, if Bitcoin mining magically hadn't ever existed or didn't develop over the last 5 years like it did. I still think we would see this tremendous growth in AI data centers, but they would probably have that harder time getting market access for a lot of reasons. Some of those reasons just being that sometimes Bitcoin mining was a middle step to get to the point where you could develop AI infrastructure on a site. And in new and novel ways, like I think the Susquehanna plant in Pennsylvania, the Talon TeraWulf deal that was flipped to Amazon is a good example of how do you assure load over an extended period of time for something that could be used in a more dedicated fashion for something like AI. What's interesting on the other side of that, Karen, I think maybe not to the point of your question, but where I see the evolution happening that's interesting is that um, large scale systems thinkers like DOE types are looking at how do we make AI more flexible because they recognize that a 5.9 dedicated power requirement is actually not great for the robustness of a system. And so are there ways we can build out these new sort of hyperscale type data centers in ways that are more flexible? Obviously, they won't be as flexible as Bitcoin mining, but that discussion I think is pretty novel and new. And I think that to the credit of maybe an underrated asset class like Bitcoin, we've been able to assure that type of flexibility inherently within the system in ways that AI could never have, at least up until recently, even considered. And so now it's, how do we build this into the toolkit of, let's just call them grid enhancing technologies in general, because there are many different ways to get after that. But flexible load is a grid enhancing technology. And I think that the demand for that is only going to increase as these systems get more complicated.
It's such a good point. Like, I think it's a much bigger challenge for AI to get to flexible than it was for Bitcoin, just due to like the nature of uptime needs for AI HPC. I mean, I think there are some new use cases where flexible. Um, yeah, I think it makes it more applicable, but I think that technology is probably pretty far away, would be my guess. But I think what's interesting about Bitcoin miners, specifically those that have diversified into AI, if you're on the same site, and I'd love to hear David's opinion on this, but if you have AI and mining on the same site, and you get to like periods of high energy costs, you can power down your mining and then capture and use that for the AI, to capture the high margins and still be a contributor to to the grid stability. I think just having that diversification makes it, from a business sense, adds a lot of value to a mining company.
Yeah, both you hit the nail on the head. I agree completely. I think it also provides the opportunity to use some of the same workforce, right? You now have the opportunity to train them to do something additional where they're getting a skill set that now applies in so many other fields. And then in addition to that, we've had some discussions with various companies that, with traditional data centers, you have so much excess capacity because of the redundancy. There's an opportunity at times to run small amounts of mining kind of in parallel with that, right? And they can shed that at any point, if they need to have their redundancy. So it again opens up an opportunity for something that would normally just be sitting or kind of a waste. They're able to make some revenue off of it.
Awesome. I mean, I think that the key is the innovation that was forced really from Bitcoin miners looking for the biggest margin, most cost efficiency. They're scrappy. And then, I mean, honestly, that's what we see in tech, right? You see the startup that is scrappier, that's lean, that's innovating, and they're the ones making the big moves. And then you have the larger tech companies getting interested and then scooping them up. But a lot of times that innovation and that, I would say the forced innovation, really, they have those incentives to make those decisions to scale quickly versus having maybe an Amazon come to Rockdale and try to do what Riot did at the site would probably look very different to the community. And again, the time it took, the engagement of the local workforce, how quickly I saw you promote people and the training that you provided. And I think that looks very differently. But absolutely what Bitcoin mining has created is something that AI infrastructure can benefit from. And when you're looking at, again, for energy and AI, do you believe that the mining is eventually going to evolve to AI? How do you see mining? Andrew, you touched a little bit on this, like if mining were to leave a community, that there are other industries that could move in. Do you think more and more mining entities, especially the public miners, are going to, not have that 50-50 split, that they're going to lean more into those AI operations?
I think so, especially in the short term. I mean, when we exist in this environment of electricity constraint, ultimately the financial incentives are going to drive the decisions about who builds where. And in a constrained environment and in a growth environment, like we're seeing with like the hyperscalers, the big four, et cetera, they are going to be incentivized to go capture any available electricity that they can capture. And because of their margins, they're able to pay a premium, and that looks very enticing to the Bitcoin mining industry in general. So absolutely in the short term. But I also think that, like we've been talking about this whole time, that's not a bad thing. It may be a new way of thinking about development to think a little bit more on the order of 5 years, not 20, 25 years for a development of these, scales essentially. But you could just look at the way in which mining hardware as an individual unit has evolved over the last 5 years of the cycle, where there's a ton of transients in rotating machines out, taking lower performing machines to other jurisdictions internationally, et cetera, right? Like we always colloquially referred to Venezuela as the graveyard of the S9, for instance, right? It was just where it made sense in certain periods of, let's say 3, 5 year cycles. And I don't think that's a bad thing either for mining facilities in general, right? If you look at it at just the facility scale, obviously there are sunk costs, but those can be captured. This is, if you want to get a little bit into the philosophical side of this, there's the Brandon Quittem has a really great essay on Bitcoin as a pioneer species, right? So looking at the analogy of nature and looking at how nature, through its systems, spreads resources and allocates resources and then seeds the next generation of development of whatever it might be. I think that that is a really intriguing concept for industry, but I think it's something that's so new because when we build a steel plant, we want that steel plant to be there for 100 years, and so we're not used to thinking about these things on short OODA loops. But I think that that's where we're evolving. Everything is evolving so rapidly that ultimately that is going to happen more and more. And I think if we're creative enough and courageous enough to think of that as a good thing, that could be really beneficial for the regions in general, and not necessarily just for this mining facility at this time. But again, this is like a new lens of economic development that we've never been able to really get our heads around before.
Yeah, I agree with most of what Andrew said. I think you're seeing in the mining space, particularly among like the large and the publicly traded mining companies, like you're seeing, not just diversification, but several of these mining companies that are trending towards being pure AI down the road. I think after they get through, whatever current cycle they're on and their mining machines, many of them will probably deprecate those and go fully into AI. And like some of them are fairly public about that. I think Wolf and Core have kind of announced designs to go that way. But you also have other large mining companies like CleanSpark and some others that are considered pure play miners. And I think they'll continue to be, well, at least hopefully continue to be that way. Because, some of it, I don't agree with the part where I don't fully agree with Andrew is that it's necessarily a good thing. Like to me, particularly if you're looking in Texas, if everyone switches to AI and off of Bitcoin mining, like you lose some of those benefits from flexible load and the grid stability, because you don't get that with AI, which makes me concerned. And then also if everyone's chasing high margins, what damage does that do to the network security over a longer period of time? And I'm personally of the belief that the margins are super high in AI right now, and I think compression is inevitable. Now that might not be 2 years, 5 years, I don't know, but like, will it always be such a higher, more profitable than Bitcoin mining? I don't know. So there's a lot of things that have to happen for me to answer that. But I personally would rather see, mining growth continue in addition to the AI that's happening. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're in a unique position right now in the market, because power is kind of, I'll say, so rare. It's a sprint to get power, and both, business models need power as their primary function. So I think, like from Riot's perspective, we're heavily looking into the traditional data center side of things, and evaluating, what we want to do. But I think I see with large companies like us, a potential diversification in the future, and then continued growth on both ends, because they both have their positives, right? And we want to continue to secure the network, and watch that grow.
In terms of the investment opportunity in this space. So again, I'm sitting here in Boston. The BBA is very institutional in focus. Look at the industries that we have here in the Northeast. I brought you on really to explain to the folks here in the Northeast, especially, why mining is relevant. And so when we're talking about adding AI to those mining operations, I don't want to diminish mining, which I think that's more what Matt's point was. It should be a thriving industry. So how should investors approach the space? And so getting away from VCs, but really more traditional investors, private equity. Tell me what you think that looks like and how you would explain this.
I can take a first stab. Also wanted to apologize to Andrew for disagreeing with him, because I love Andrew and he's one of the brightest people I've met. So, but you're not always right either, Andrew. Anyway, to answer your question, I actually had a witty response to that as well. To the investors that are listening to this, they should have invested yesterday before Trump decided to do a 90-day moratorium on tariffs, because everything's up like 20% today. And to be honest, like if you're an investor and you're looking at the mining space and you're looking at a chart over the last 6 months, you're probably pretty spooked, because it's been a rough go for miners. They've had quite a roller coaster ride over the last, basically since last April, right? When the halving happened. It's been an interesting ride, ups and downs. I think what's been interesting, I get asked this question a lot actually. So like, I think what's interesting in this space is when I first started, everyone wanted, everyone that wanted to get invested into Bitcoin but didn't want to actually own Bitcoin would just buy publicly traded mining stocks, right? And so it was like this huge high beta to Bitcoin, and that's basically how you got exposure without having to own Bitcoin. And I was under the impression, or I had the hypothesis that come the halving last April, that that narrative would change and the launch of the ETFs and there would be less of a beta, but that actually was wrong. I was wrong about that. Like the beta still remains high. And there's some mining companies like Marathon and others that are kind of following the MicroStrategy path, right? Where it's like we accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible. So like you can, it's almost like a proxy to an ETF. Um, what I like to look at is like some of the more sophisticated publicly traded mining companies, Riot, Cypher, CleanSpark, like some of these, they're out there that are starting to think more about the bottom line. How do we hedge out? How do we get the lower cost energy? How do we hedge out our future exposure to Bitcoin, to hash price? There's Bitfarms has a really cool way of looking at it where they say, we try and get the lowest hash cost possible, highest revenue possible, and they just look at it strictly from a margin perspective. Higher margin percentage, obviously. So my long-winded rant here is like, I think for investors, you start looking at the companies that are paying attention to, free cash flow and being profitable and like long-term strategic initiatives to be a big boy company with like real, CFOs and real hedging instruments that are being utilized. And I think we're starting to see that, and I'm encouraged by that space. So I would encourage investors that are looking at miners to look at, read through 10Ks and read through how they're going about this and not just be a proxy to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree. And just to bounce off of that, I think, there's companies like Riot. I think Marathon, and Core Scientific is making some different changes to their model, but we offer tours too, right? So if you're an investor, you reach out to our PR team online, you're able to come out and actually see the site. We'll go through models, we'll explain what our thought process is. You can look at our financials. So it's a pretty unique opportunity to get some real insight into what you're investing in.
Yeah, I actually really like that suggestion because I think what gets lost is people just, a lot of people don't even understand what Bitcoin mining is, right? And to just go see the scale and magnitude, even like go to Rockdale, go to Corsicana, go to Odessa, Fort Stockton, like just to look at the scale of these things, it's massively impressive. And I think people, once they get there and the tangible, viewpoint of seeing like racks and racks of machines and all the technology that goes to cooling those machines and like immersion facilities and all that, like then it becomes real. And so I think David's suggestion of site tours is, I would highly recommend that.
I think there is absolutely, having done that, not enough. I love going out to the sites. I love being able to see what's physically being built and the folks engaged on the project. I can really speak to at Riot the pride that the employees have working there, especially during visits as it was scaling so quickly. And Dave talking about, again, like people being promoted. And so you're talking about growth of the workforce as well as we have a new building or building D's final online, and this is what we've got going on. And so, yes, to see it, because I do think, especially for folks in the Northeast, it's really hard to wrap their arms around what the hell mining is and think of what's actually going on in sites like Rockdale or Coshocton, or whether that's Corsicana or other locations, right? The scale is pretty awesome. So absolutely encourage anyone who's interested to go out and do these site visits. And Andrew is a wonderful Uber driver, by the way. Can't say enough.
You're welcome in Ohio anytime.
One of the questions that we've gotten is on the perspective you have on immersion mining. So this is unusual that I didn't talk about the difference between air and immersion on this call. Dave, you mentioned those first buildings at Rockdale were air cooled, and then you have some immersion mining. What are your thoughts on immersion at this point?
Yeah, so they both have their unique advantages and disadvantages, right? So I'll talk a little bit about both, right? And so particularly in Texas, right, you've got some very, very hot summers that can be difficult with their mining. It's much harder to control that chip temperature. So previously, back in the S9 era, S19 era, and some of these other models, we saw some pretty negative impacts on the machines in the summertime because they just couldn't handle the heat, right? And you can only get so much heat out with that passive air cooling. And so immersion's been around for a very, very long time, right? And Bitcoin miners have kind of adopted the immersion model. And I guess the best way I describe it is you've got a Mercedes and you can got a Honda Civic, and then Bitcoin mining kind of pulls somewhere in the middle. They pull out most of the bells and whistles out of that immersion that's not necessarily needed because the machines are much more robust than your typical data center, and they can operate on a much wider range of temperature. So um, the unique thing about immersion is you can control the temperature much better. It's more of a steady temperature, and you can operate in a much wider range depending on your environmental conditions. The downside is it's much more labor intensive. It's far more capex to set up, and it's very specialized. So where you have a very small group of people managing an air mine, you've got double to triple to manage an immersion mine because of servicing the dry coolers, continuously cleaning the fluid, managing pumps and heat exchangers. You've got to make sure that you've got glycol mixtures in the water loop. There's a ton of different things. And then in the summertime, you've got your adiabatics where you have to supplement extra cooling to pull that heat out of the tanks. So I think the cool thing that we've seen on the Riot side, though, is the machines are now catching up and they're becoming much more and more robust. So the air model is kind of starting to come closer to running in the same performance metrics as immersion because the machines have become more and more robust over the years, and we've seen some very positive results from our air buildings. So.
We're almost at time, but okay, I'm going to try to fit in two other questions here. What does global mining competition look like?
What do you mean by competition? Just like where does the hash rate come from, or were there power sources, or?
So we've obviously focused on US mining operations. So the question doesn't really elaborate, but I think
Okay.
talking about what is the mining landscape outside the US, I think there's obvious threat overseas of Bitcoin mining. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak in the near term, and anyone feel free to chime in. I mean, near term, like, I think roughly like 40% of the hash rate is in the US right now. But a lot of those chips and machines are coming from China. Now that as of today, we're seeing like 125% tariff for China, like that dynamic could shift and incentivize hash rate to move elsewhere. I think the hash rate that's already here will stay here, but it becomes more expensive to grow hash rate here, and that might actually have an impact on overall network growth. Whether or not it equates to more growth in China or Russia or, Asia in general, I'd probably say that's probably a good bet. But we're already seeing, there's growth in South America already, there's growth in the Middle East. So I think diversification actually geographically is a good thing. We don't want it all in the US. I mean, maybe we do. But from a network perspective, having redundancy globally is a good thing, in my opinion. That's just, quick take.
Yeah, I agree with everything Matt said. I think the one thing that's interesting comparatively and just a variable to consider is that countries that have a nationalized energy system can function very differently than we do here in the United States. And I think that in a game theoretic where Bitcoin becomes more interesting and valuable to the global economic system and order, certain nation states are going to be able to participate in the game without necessarily the same considerations that private US companies do. And I think that has the potential to change things a little bit more than it is currently. There may be some of that already, but I think long term, that's something to really think about.
Awesome. Last question, I believe, will be, are mining companies interested in fusion energy?
That one's for me. That's my friend Brian. Yeah, fusion's too far out, Brian, and you know that. Nuclear, however, in general, is something that I think will become increasingly important, especially as that becomes a national priority, is how do you incentivize the build out of some of these small modular facilities and other things. And when the world figures out a sustained fusion reactor, then sooner or later, yes, of course, we'll mine Bitcoin on that. But that's 10 years away, as we like to say.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We have just a few minutes left, so I would like to leave time for each of you to give your closing comments on mining and the truth you want the folks at the listening today to have.
I'll jump in. I think my final thoughts. I think don't believe everything you hear. Mining has a ton of positive impacts, not only in small communities, but in large communities and on the world as a whole. So I think I would just recommend do your research. There's tons of mining conferences that happen throughout the year in states, in every state essentially. And you can really go and get a bunch of great information, meet companies like Riot. We typically have booths at the larger events. So come meet us, talk to us, get an understanding of what we do. You get to hear some unique perspectives of a ton of different people at the different stages, and sign up for site tours. If you're invested in it, reach out to our investor relations team and get signed up for a tour. And thanks for the time.
Yeah, I agree with David. I think having people that are curious in the space that have maybe been succumbed to like some of the negative discourse, do your own education. I love the idea of going to these conferences. You can learn a ton. There's so many different interesting panels and topics that are discussed at these conferences. We definitely agree. Go on a site tour. And going back to the investor question you made, like there's a lot of maturity that's happening in these larger companies where they are, as I said, they're doing long-term power hedges. They're being more focused on where they're sourcing their power. They're, using derivatives. I see it firsthand through my company. They're using derivatives to lock in future revenue. They're using derivatives to protect against downside. Like those are the companies that you want to invest in, the ones that are, being mature and maturing with the space. And we're seeing it. And I think it's extremely encouraging for the longevity of the mining world.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you for having us here today, Karen, and the BBA. I think this was a great discussion. I think I'll echo what the others have said and just sort of land the plane on the point that in any system, you're always putting something into it to get something out of it. All right. Return on investment is not just financial, right? It's energy, it's power, it's systems. And if you think that Bitcoin mining is using too much power, you're not asking yourself the question of what are we getting out of it? And I think the high level story here is that what we're getting out of it is a more robust energy system and more energy generation and a more robust grid for the future of our country, and also securing perhaps the most novel financial network that the world has ever seen. And I think both of those things in tandem are extremely beneficial to us in the world. And I think it's worth investing in, and I think it's a worthwhile use of that energy.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. That was the perfect way to end. I want to encourage everyone to complete our survey, and thank you again for the time. We hope to have you at the next BBA event. Thank you so much to the panelists.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.